Hello everybody and welcome to this video about decolonization in Africa in the 1960s, in which we will be using the Congo as our case study. As always, we begin with our learning outcomes, so by the end of this presentation you guys should know the four causes of decolonization after World War II. You guys should know 3 facts about the Congo and its fight for independence. And finally, you guys should know 3 reasons why there was instability in many newly independent countries in the 1960s and after. We have already looked at decolonization in our study of Vietnam and the removal of the French from Indochina, and in India and the removal of the British from there. Today we will look at the Congo and the removal of the Belgians. So just to give a brief overview on the colonization of the continent of Africa. Prior to 1870, about 10% of the African continent was under European control. Generally, these territories were based around the coast of Africa. However, after the 1870s, European powers pursued the acquisition of overseas territories to expand their empires. A big part of this overseas expansion happened in Africa, and it is known as the Scramble for Africa. This is when European powers invaded, occupied, and colonized the majority of Africa. The scramble for Africa really started with the Berlin Conference of 1884, where the major European powers negotiated who would get what territory in Africa and agreed to respect the claims of the European countries to these territories. In total, 14 countries were represented, with no representatives coming from Africa. Germany, Spain, Italy, Portugal, Belgium, Britain and France all received new territory, with Britain and France having the largest amounts. In fact, by 1914, only 2 African states remained independent. Liberia, which had been settled by African American slaves in the 1800s, and Ethiopia or Abyssinia, which we saw was invaded by Mussolini in 1936 when we were studying World War II. However, in the 1960s alone, over 35 African countries claimed independence from the European imperial powers. So what caused this? Well, there are 4 main causes that we look at. So after World War II, European powers, their economies were wrecked and had to avail of Marshall aid, which we saw in our study of the Cold War. And it was harder for them to maintain their imperial armies in their colonies. And they also seemed to be a little bit more vulnerable to these colonies after the devastation of World War II. The second cause that we talk about is that the European powers had created a small elite of local African leaders who were educated in Western universities. And here they were exposed to Western ideas like self-determination, which we saw promoted in the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 after World War I. And these educated African elites began to question why these principles didn't extend to Africa. These ideas promoted by the new educated African elites led to the third cause, the rise of African nationalism, which began in the 19th century but reached its zenith or its most popular point in the 1950s and 60s. The final cause was that the USA and the USSR, the superpowers, wanted decolonization to happen, and as the superpowers of the world, that desire had a massive effect. These 2 countries were so powerful that they didn't need to go down the traditional colonial route and instead built their empires through dominated the newly decolonized countries' economies and removing leaders they were unhappy with. As we have seen from our map of Africa after the Berlin Conference, the Congo, which is situated here, came under Belgian control. The Belgian leader, Leopold II, tricked the other nations at the conference into believing that he would end slavery in the Congo and to build a nation of Congo states. And instead, he set about exploiting the country in the most savage of ways. So Leopold had become interested in the Congo when stories from Henry Stanley of this amazing land became popular in Europe in the 1870s. In particular, he was interested in the resources like rubber trees, the ivory tusked elephants and gold-wearing natives were things that interested him. The land was stolen from the natives who signed treaties that they didn't understand, and Leopold authorized the use of as much force as necessary to make the colony profitable. They forced the natives to farm rubber for them, kidnapping their wives and children until they met the quotas that were unrealistically set for them. People who resisted were killed on the spot, and others were beaten. They were whipped with lashes for not meeting their quotas. And when revolts broke out in the Congo, Leopold sent troops into the villages to exterminate young men. To make sure bullets weren't wasted, soldiers were to return with the severed right hands of the men they had killed, and this was called the hand tax. If the soldier missed his quota or used bullets hunting, they would cut off the hands of living women and children. Between 1895 and 1908, it's estimated that at least 10 million people died through being murdered, through starvation, and through mistreatment. Definitely something that would be considered a genocide. And word of these atrocities got out thanks to reports from people like Roger Casement, who we met as one of the leaders of the 1916 Rising in Ireland, and other humanitarians. So Leopold no longer was allowed direct control after these reports got out, but instead the Belgian government ruled from 1908. Conditions did improve, but resources were still being exploited. After an uprising in 1960, Belgium held an election in the Congo, which the MNC party, with Patrice Lumumba as one of its leaders, won, and they decided to declare independence on the 30th of June 1960. However, the Congo was very unstable after this declaration, with revolts breaking out in different parts of the Congo, like the area called Katanga. And they were trying to claim independence, and they were backed by Belgian businesses who had interest there, and even Belgian troops stayed there. The UN ordered Belgium to remove its troops. Lumumba looked for help from the United States to deal with these revolts, but when no help was coming, he turned to the USSR. And with this, a military coup took place, and Lumumba was arrested and murdered. Eventually, a military leader named Colonel Mobutu took over with the aid of America in 1965, and he remained as a dictator of the Congo, which he renamed Zaire, until 1997. Decades of violence and oppressive rule continued after the Congo gained independence, as it did in many countries that tried to throw off the shackles of colonialism. And there's three main reasons that we look at for this. The first one is simple geography. The boundaries set up by the colonial powers became the boundaries of new nation states, and these were just lines drawn on a map. Even if there were people who had, a deep hatred towards one another, they were expected to stay within the one country. A good example of this is the Hutu and the Tutsi people of Rwanda, which would eventually lead to a genocide of the Hutu in the 1990s, which would also affect the Congo. Another reason was that European nations, they claimed to civilize and bring economic development to these colonies. And while there was a certain amount of things that they did bring, the development that they brought was focused on building infrastructure like roads and railways, but only to get the resources from the countries and to export them for their own profit. It wasn't to benefit the people of the country. And the final reason for this violence and instability was when the European countries left these African countries they had colonized, they did not have the institutions necessary to thrive in the industrial world after World War II. And this led to these countries becoming dependent on the USA and the USSR and not being able to succeed on their own. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. So by now you guys should know the 4 causes of decolonization after World War II. You guys should know 3 facts about the Congo and its fight for independence. And finally, you guys should know 3 reasons why there was instability in many newly independent countries in the 1960s and after. Thanks for watching. Hope you guys got something good from this video.